Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate your willingness to hold this hearing, and I particularly appreciate the chance to speak with these three individuals. As you know, we've been receiving a lot of briefings from various luminaries in the technology community on matters related to AI, but I'm afraid they're not as closely involved to the nitty-gritty of what's happening in the AI world as each of the three of you are, and therefore I particularly look forward to your testimony today and for our chance to ask you some questions. I'm in the camp of being more terrified about AI than I am in the camp of those thinking this is going to make everything better for the world. Even though I know in the analysis that's been done so far that there are wonderful advances that would surely come as a result of AI. I just saw a study, you may have seen it with the Boston Consulting Group, where they put two different groups of consultants on various tasks. One had access to AI, the other did not. The one that had access to AI ended up producing a superior product in most cases. And it's like, okay, that'll make us more productive in providing advice and counsel and doing all sorts of other procedures in the business world. I'm sure government can be made more effective. I'm sure research in a whole host of areas, including medical, will be more effective. So there are wonderful benefits, but at the same time, there are enormous risks to humanity at large, to our national security domestically, to jobs in the U.S., to a whole host of things. And I must admit the frightening side has the edge, at least in my own thinking. The discussions that I've heard so far about AI look at ways for us to potentially prevent some of the most severe downsides. One is, individuals point out correctly, that we need to coordinate with other nations and perhaps have some kind of an international consortium or international agreement that relates to AI. I don't know how that would work, where it would be housed, how we would initiate that, and whether that's realistic. There's also been discussion that we need to have a separate agency or department of the federal government with individuals who focus on AI and look at the companies developing it, developing strategies, and giving advice and counsel to people like the chair and myself. Frankly, a lot of, in my case, 76-year-olds are not going to figure out how to regulate AI because we can barely use our smartphone. So that's another area, which is, should we have that kind of an agency or that kind of a department? There's also been a discussion that before a new AI generation is released to the public or put on open source, that it ought to go through some trial period with individuals expert testing it and seeing if it can be abused and how it could be abused, and perhaps limiting its public launch until it's actually had those potential flaws corrected. And finally, a question of how can we control the world's worst actors from having access to a technology that they could use to threaten us or threaten humanity, for that matter. And some have suggested that because of the computing power necessary for AI systems to work, that we could manage the flow of and the presence of, if you will, large power semiconductor chips, see where they are, see who's making them, see where they go, restrict where they go. I don't know whether that's a realistic option for management of this or not. But those are, I think the questions that, for someone like myself who's more concerned about the downside than the upside, my question is, how do we, and recognizing that this is going to be all over the world, what can we do to try and prevent as much of the downside as possible? So with that, Madam Chair, I look forward to your questions, and I may have one or two myself. If the objective of this hearing was to calm our nerves and give us more confidence that everything is fine, it has not done that. It has underscored the fright that exists in my soul that this is a very dangerous development. And I realize it's not like overnight we clicked on a switch and now we have AI and we have machine learning. Before we didn't. We've been having machine learning, but it's now reached a level with generative AI that's in many respects quite different than what we've known in the past. And each of you have suggested some of the ways we might be able to safeguard against the worst kind of outcomes in the respective areas that have been described. The challenge that comes to mind is, one, as I listen to your recommendations, I understand about half. Maybe that is an overstatement, but in terms of, you described the various stages, we need to put safeguards here, safeguards there. I'm not sure I understand what the stages are. I don't know what's involved in them. And the likelihood that senators are going to be able to figure that out and draft a bill that focuses on this area just strikes me as being just not reasonable. It's just not going to happen. Not in the House, not in the Senate. And so I look for your counsel or your thinking on how do we get from where we are, which is no safeguards at all, to the safeguards you would recommend, or others. And I can tell you that were I the chief executive officer of the country or the chief executive officer of a corporation, let's say I was a CEO of a major corporation and I had 2 or 3 areas, let's say head of a bank, 2 or 3 areas I'm really concerned about. Quantum computing, being able to break into our algorithm, into our systems to determine, move money around and so forth. What I would do is I would first decide who I want to put in charge. So there's going to be someone in charge of our effort to combat these threats, all of the threats. And it might be an agency, it might be a department, but I'm going to put someone in charge. Then I'm going to say to them, you're going to need to hire the expertise in each one of those threats or opportunities. And either hire someone to oversee each of those areas, and then they may need to hire outside people who have expertise there, or multiple outside people, or perhaps hire their own staff. But one or the other, we're going to have to take this apart piece by piece and solve it piece by piece. Am I wrong in that assessment? And if I'm right, where should this be? Who should be responsible? I mean, Dr. Murdoch was in Homeland Security. I mean, should we task this with Homeland Security? They've got so much on their plate. Right now, it's like, oh gosh, here's one more thing, Secretary Mayorkas, that we can criticize you for. So, is there? Do we set up a new agency, a new department? And I don't know if you know where this all resides right now, but what's the process? How do we get from where we are to actually putting in place these safeguards? That's the question. And then, how much time do we have to do it? So with that, maybe in the order of those who offered testimony, you might just go down the row and give any thoughts you have about how we do what you've recommended.
Well, Senator, thank you for expressing your concerns, and I'm sorry that our solutions were not adequately comprehensible.
Wasn't your job, that's all right.
But if I could offer one potential source of optimism, think about the difference in safety from a fire safety perspective of a candle and an electric light bulb. I think everyone in this room would say if this place burned down, it would be much more likely to have happened from a candle than from an electric light bulb. But that was not such an obvious distinction when electricity was first invented. When electricity was first invented, it was a safety disaster. It was the constant source of fires. It was the constant source of the electrocution death of electrical workers. Electricity isn't inherently safe. The companies and the government agencies of this country made it safe through deliberate effort over time. And AI right now is not inherently safe, but it's also not inherently dangerous. It will depend upon the work that we do in the coming years. And there is a lot of incredibly important work to be done. Now, one problem that you identified, which is the capacity of the government, you pointed out the capacity in the Senate to understand these issues. Jeff and I just got out of government not that long ago, and there was a dramatic shortage of AI talent on these issues. There is a significant shortage of biosecurity talent. That is not to mean that there are not smart, hardworking people on these issues, but if you were asking me to sort of design the program to address these problems and compare it against the current skill sets and numbers of individuals serving in government, we just don't have enough. And we must think of a program that would actually result in the outcomes that we want. So for example, my own prior organization, the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, was given the authority, to have 100 civil servant or military personnel staff. But the result there was that military personnel were assigned to our organization. They may or may not have had prior understanding or expertise in AI, and there was not an existing program that they could be sent to sort of give them a crash course on AI. These are all structures that are going to have to be created to increase the bureaucratic capacity of the United States government, and that is some of the most important work that can be done. In terms of what can be done from a regulatory perspective, I would argue that we should think about the levers in the system where there might be a high return on investment. We want to make it hard for accidents to happen if they are catastrophic. We want to make it hard for malicious activity to happen. But we don't want to ban all of these good activities as well. And so using, for example, biosecurity as an example, the mechanism of the problem that your question was about, Senator Hassan, was why is it a challenge? Why does AI make it easier to make bioweapons? Well, part of it is the nature of existing regulations. The current biosecurity system is primarily a list-based system. If you want to get access to anthrax pathogen, that is on a list. It is regulated because it is on a list. The challenge with AI systems is that they could assist in the development of novel pathogens that are not on a list anywhere. And so we must think of, okay, if DNA synthesis companies are going to need the ability to detect that something is a pathogen, even if it's never been created anywhere before and never been tested for pathogenic properties, how are we going to ensure that those companies have that capability? And that is some of the most promising research that the government could invest in. How do we identify the risk of malicious use for things that are not currently on a list somewhere?
So Senator Young, my fellow Hoosier, said recently that his analysis was that for the vast majority of issues that AI touches, there is already some part of government that has authority and responsibility to deal with it. And I agree with this. So self-driving cars, Department of Transportation. AI in medical context, Health and Human Services. Most of AI can, in principle, be handled by the current setup of government, with a few exceptions. One is that if someone is making or deploying an AI that is predictably going to get millions of people killed, there is no part of government that has clear authorities and responsibility for addressing that. And so that needs to be created. There are several places that it would be logical to create it. An independent agency is one, DHS, which this committee works with, is another. There's also Department of Commerce, particularly the Bureau of Industry and Security. There's also DOE, which has a lot of existing relevant authorities that could synergize there. Wherever it is that the Congress chooses to put it, it needs to have the authorities to be able to say, this is a problem and we're not going to let that AI go out, needs to have the responsibility to understand this at a technical level. Thankfully, no part of government has to work alone. First, they have all the rest of government to work with, but also all of American society. So any part of government that has this responsibility should be trying to solve the talent problem by making friends, right? So whether they're working in government or working in industry, there are multiple mechanisms to reach technical experts.
Thank you.
Great. I think there's a few things. So the threats are overwhelming. And if you just focus on what could kill you, I do think it's a little paralyzing. But I do think there's a very clear set of actions that are necessary, that have been used before. And the first step is information gathering. Mandatory and voluntary incident reporting is an incredibly useful way, both within specific sectors and across, to be able to get evidence of what's breaking. It's unfortunate, but sometimes you need a little bit more oomph to actually get action, and having evidence of harm is really helpful in being able to do that. So I think information gathering is extremely important. Two, to strengthen that information gathering, we need to strengthen our auditing community. That could be at GAO, that could be private sector, that could be any civil society organization that has a concern. But strengthening, raising the bar of that auditing community, developing those skills. There's a bit of investment that could go there. There's a bit more standard, community development. There's a lot of things that could go in that space. Third, as Jeff was just mentioning, and we heard other times, there's a lot of agencies that have authorities that are very germane to the question at hand. You know, FTC, FAA, and the alphabet soup that I will not repeat. But these are really important roles. And I think there's some tweaking. I think we first need to do a catalog of what authorities they have that are relevant to AI and figure out if they're adequate. Do they need small adjustments? If so, let's figure out how to do that to empower them. We have biological conventions and other things for certain kinds of, like, if there's actually a harm that's being engineered, we have agreements for across nations to be able to track some of these things. I'm not saying they're perfect, but we have those. We might want to look at them and see if there's some updates. I think there'd be will across nations to strengthen some of those ideas. So I've talked about info gathering, auditing, and some who of existing agencies. I do think if you start considering about future organizations, my thing has been new organizations. So starting up at IARPA and in the private sector and watching DHS start up, there's lessons learned there. So if you drop a ton of cash on a new organization, it's really easy to make mistakes. But just giving them a little bit and then forgetting about them and never increasing their budget is another problem. So I don't actually know how to do that, but I think there has to be some kind of mechanism where you stage funding and you expand it with some kind of very clear waypoints, and you don't just dump it in, because it stresses out government officials to execute that money and do it all right, and their oversight is super high when you've got $1 billion in your pocket as opposed to a smaller amount. Anyway, so I think this is not my expertise, I just think you need to very carefully stage that growth, because as we learn. Lastly, and I mentioned this over and over in my opening comments, so I won't belabor it now, but we need to learn. We need to set up agile systems to be able to pick up information and learn how to address and how to collect information from industry. We don't know really how to do that. What questions should we ask to understand the level of threat? How do we update that thinking? How do we continue that integration? How do we avoid regulatory capture by that process of just becoming too close to industry? These are things we don't know, but if we set it up to pick that up and gradually grow and learn, I think it's really important. The last thing, you asked about how much time do we have? And I think in some cases we have no time. I mean, information gathering on harms that are happening today, every day we delay is less information we have. There's things like, Skynet in its super empowered, system of, working across physical and digital worlds. I think we got some time there. But I'm not trying to minimize that threat, but we need to start taking these very clear steps long before that. So I think to avoid getting overwhelmed, I think we need to think of it as a very staged process. Hopefully that's helpful.